Welcome to our final installment of our Commercialization 101 series, Getting Investor Ready and Funding Options. So if you've been attending our seminars, you'll have seen our prior introductions. For those of you just joining us today, I'd like to briefly introduce to you to the Westmead Research Hub Commercialization team. Each of us basically are commercialization managers representing different Research Hub entities. Namely, David represents Western Sydney Local Health District and Sydney Children's Hospital Network, and Julia Hill represents Children's Medical Research Institute, and then myself, I represent University of Sydney and Westmead Institute for Medical Research. We are actually quite fortunate to have amongst us a unique set of complementary experience and skill sets, enabling us to draw upon each other's experiences, and this helps us work efficiently across the Westmead Research Hub as a team. So today we would like to take you through the following topics. I'll start by setting the stage in telling you, in identifying what is a commercial opportunity. I will talk about the types of commercial opportunities, as well as how to recognize that your research has commercial value. David will then go through building a business case, and he'll look at the problem being solved, competitive advantage, the target market. Julia will then take you through the pathway to market and go through commercialization strategy, licensing, and startup companies. I'll then finish off with a bit about funding opportunities and talk about some commercialization funding partners that are available to us and leveraging investment. From the seminar, we are hoping you will gain a better understanding of how to identify, develop, target, and apply your valuable research outcomes, what resources, both intellectual and financial, are available to the team for this process, and what attributes your research outcomes and its application will give for a better choice of success. Some of you will already have seen this slide before, but we would like to basically reiterate this definition for you. What is research commercialization? It is the process of managing the transfer of research outcomes to broad market application. It is basically the transfer of knowledge gained and getting that knowledge out there to the market. When thinking about research commercialization, one of the first useful questions to ask yourself is, what is a commercial opportunity? It's important to think about the commercial opportunities that your research might provide. Here are some of the things that you should consider. The pictures represent examples of what has been commercialized out of Westmead or is currently being commercialized. For example, your research might lead to a tangible item that has value on the market. Tangible items usually are easier to identify because you will have a discrete product you're considering. Your research might lead to the identification of a new compound, for example, like a small molecule or a therapeutic antibody. Or it might lead to a new medical device, such as the one shown, or other tangible products, like a composition that is useful for gene or cell therapy. It is also important not to overlook a new process or method that may be a manufacturing or production type method. Or you might develop a new teaching or intervention tool, like the example shown, which was developed at SCHN and that has been successfully licensed. Perhaps your research also leads to the ability to provide a service that are research tools or services that could be sold or contracted. Platform technologies are basically those that have far-reaching breadth and utility. Some basic examples would be the discovery of recombinant DNA or stem cells, which are entirely new industries, where entirely new industries may be created. This is where the technology itself serves as a springboard to foster new industry, to even create a paradigm shift in an existing one. Platform technologies are exciting and seem to have endless potential. However, I caution that whilst platform technologies are very desirable for a startup, they can actually pose significant challenges to commercialization, as they are usually at an early stage and they can lack focus. A good example that I've had experience with is one where there was the identification of a peptide that could modulate inflammation. Whilst the ability to modulate the inflammation was very clear and there was sufficient valuable data to file a patent application and form a startup, with the intention of treating many inflammatory disorders and diseases, the startup ultimately failed. One contributing factor for this failure was that the development of the technology for any one particular inflammatory disease was at a very early stage. And it was difficult to focus the research into one area after the company was spun out. So I'll now hand over to David to talk a bit about about building a business case.
Just working out which mouse is which. So from your research, you've identified a novel innovation and determined that it might have commercial value. We've now protected that intellectual property. We now need to start building the business case, which will really inform our strategy to take the innovation to market. It's not just about the research. We need to look at the market space that you want to be in and see how your technology fits into that market space. This slide here just shows you some of the different elements that we consider in determining whether a research innovation has commercial value. In our earlier seminars, we've talked about the intellectual property position. It's important that we have a sufficiently broad and defendable IP position to create a barrier to entry to competitors, to justify the resources that will need to go into developing the technology through to market. We also need to consider freedom to operate, so whether your technology might infringe on the intellectual property rights of any other party. If it does, we might need to get a license to that technology to be able to commercialize your product. We then consider the potential market. So does your technology solve a particular market need, and can it be turned into a new or direct product or service offering? Does it have a competitive advantage, being like a unique selling point, such as addressing an unmet need, performing better than the existing products on the market, or providing a cost advantage? And then finally, this information really helps to inform who the potential partners might be to commercialize the product with. What are the unique selling points that we really need to substantiate with scientific evidence to get uptake of the technology? And what are the pathways to take the technology through to market? So these all help to inform our commercialization strategy. Industry is going to consider the commercial value of the technology and ask, is it worth the trouble? The risks will be weighed against the potential return on investment. And we need to keep in mind that our research innovations are typically quite early stage, that are arising from our research, and carry with them a number of risks. There's the technical risk, intellectual property risk, and the market risk. There's the time to market and also the development costs to get there. At the same time, your technologies at the earlier stage is when the value of the technology is at its lowest. So if you can address some of these technical risks and intellectual property risks at an earlier stage in your research program, that's really going to help increase the value of the technology and make it more attractive for investment. And ultimately for industry, the larger the potential return, the more cost and risk they're going to accept. So now let's take a look at how we go about defining the market for our technology. So markets are comprised of customers, which might be individuals or organisations, and customers have wants and needs that can be satisfied by products or services. So really the starting point in defining the market for our technology is to understand the particular problem that it solves, or particular problems that it solves. And once you have a good idea of what those problems are, you can then start to work out who is most likely to suffer from those problems, and they're your customers that form your market. So when we're defining the market, we look at the idea and the technology itself, how that can be turned into new products or services, and then the how those products and services fit into the market. So if looking at the idea or technology, how does it differ from the state of the art? Does it have applications outside of what that initial problem was that you were looking at, or is it a platform technology with a range of different applications? When looking at the products or services that it can be turned into, what are the potential products? How big is the impact of that technology? And do the economics stack up? Is there potential for this to be economically viable? When looking at the market need for the technology, we need to consider, does the technology address a significant enough market need that customers are going to be willing to pay for it? Is the market of a sufficient size in the territories that you can access, and is it growing or is it declining? Who's the customer for your technology? If it's something that can be turned into a standalone product, the end user might be your customer. Whereas if it's a part of an overall product or something that might fit into a manufacturing process, a distributor may be your customer at the end. Need to consider the time to market and stage of development you're at. The market weight may well change by the time your product reaches the market. So if you look at pharmaceuticals as an example, in a particular disease indication, there might be tens or hundreds of different products that are targeting that particular indication. If you're 10 to 12 years away from market, then you need to consider what the competitive environment is and your product differentiation in the future. Need to think about who the existing players are in the market space. They're both competitors, but also the companies that could be potential licensees that will want to approach to commercialize your technology. If there isn't a market, if there isn't any competition there also isn't a market at that point in time. So that means you're ultimately going to have to create your own market, which requires a much more substantial investment of resources. And finally, consider any barriers to entry, whether it's regulatory requirements in our particular space, freedom to operate issues, or even geopolitical type issues. So once we've defined the market, then we need to start thinking about what is our initial target market segments and product applications that we want to target. And no business, particularly a small one, can be all things to all people. So it's really important that we can define our target market as narrowly as possible. And this process is really known as creating a niche, and it's something that even big companies do to be successful. So in determining what your initial target market should be, we look at whether the market's accessible. Can you use objective variables to identify and measure your target market and gauge its size? Is the market accessible? Can your market be targeted through communication and distribution? You need to be able to reach your end users. Are there unique needs that are unmet by your competition, and how significant is the pain of customers within your market? How significant is that to your market? And then finally, it needs to be substantial. So are the numbers sufficient to justify the resources that it's going to take to develop the product to market and to target that market? So now let's take a look at defining your competitive advantage. So you need to think about who is currently targeting your market's need. Competitors aren't just competing products, but anything which targets your market's need. Knowing your competitors is a really big advantage. They're a great source of information about your target market and also really help you test your value proposition. And your value proposition is the wants and needs of your customers that can be satisfied by your technology offering. Also keep in mind that your biggest competitors may not be your direct competitors, but they might be new products or technologies that will radically disrupt your market. I mean, think of Uber in the taxi world or the internet disrupting print media. So what is your competitive advantage? It is what makes your customers choose your product and service over the competition. And it's really about creating a superiority in one of three things. Either an unmet need, so it might be a new drug, for example, that targets a clinical unmet need. A product or cost advantage, so it might be a lower cost solution to the same customer problem, or a benefit of the technology which can command a price premium. And then the third is the technological advantage, which solves a customer problem better than the current competition. So in the end, in terms of your competitive advantage, to be successful, you really need to be able to articulate what the benefit your technology provides in your target market that's better than the competition. So what can you do in your research to help create a competitive advantage? Firstly, demonstrating the feasibility of your technology and its unique selling point. And this is really demonstrating proof of concept of your technology, which might, for example, be creating a working prototype or demonstrating efficacy of your technology in a relevant preclinical model. Secondly, and even better still, if you can demonstrate that your technology outperforms the current standard of care or gold standard product. And these are really the key elements of commercially focused research which demonstrate the value of your technology to industry and investors. So this leads into what we call the killer experiment, and that's the research data that clearly proves the value of your technology compared to existing products or methods. So rather than simply demonstrating that your technology performs relative to a control like you'd usually do for academic publication, include the best available competitor products and show that your technology outperforms the competitors. If your competitive advantage is in the form of a cost benefit, then demonstrate that your lower cost solution performs comparably to the current competitors. And this really provides the most compelling data to demonstrate the value of your innovation. So a few things to consider. Markets do change quickly, and it can be a race to develop your product or technology to market. I mean, we see it time and time again in drug development and medical device development, where either a particular class of drugs or a device in a particular clinical indication fails in later stage development, and it completely puts a freeze over the entire space in terms of both investment in that space and industry adopting technology. So it's just an example of how the markets can change quickly there. Nobody knows your technology or product as well as you do as an inventor, so you need to be committed, not just involved, to enable the technology to be developed into a success. And finally, commercialization is challenging. You need to be mindful of the risks that are involved in the partners and investors that we really need to take early stage technology out of research organisations to the market. So you need to be passionate, but you also need to be rational. Not all research with commercial potential will be a commercial success. So we've now determined that there's a market for our technology. We have a competitive advantage for our technology. I'm going to hand over to Julia, who's going to take you through some of the pathways for taking your innovation to market.
Thanks, David. This one, isn't it? Okay, so we have understood what the competitive advantages of the technology are. We know what your product is. You've identified your target market. So now we need to work out how we're going to take it forward and what the best path to bring the technology and the product to market is going to be. And there's really no hard and fast rules about this. It is very much determined on a case-by-case basis, and it will depend on the technology. It will depend on the potential partners, and in some part it will also depend on the scientists themselves and what their motivations and desires are. The three main mechanisms by which we bring intellectual property to the market are things that we touched on in the first seminar. So licensing via a licensing arrangement, via a startup company, or assignment of intellectual property. Now, licensing tends to run through everything, so we can license your intellectual property to a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company or somebody that you might have industry engagement with, an R&D contract with them, but we also license technology generally to startup companies as well. So a license is you grant a third party the permission to exploit your intellectual property, and in the case of a startup company, the other aspect to the startup company is having investors that put the equity investment into that initial entity, into that new entity. An assignment of intellectual property is actually quite rarely used, but it might be used in circumstances where you've got a patent family that you're not using anymore because your research has taken a different direction, but somebody else might see value in it. They might come along and offer you something for that, and you're quite happy to just sell it to them outright and have no further involvement. So assignments can happen, but it's not very common. So in considering which pathway to take, with licensing is generally used when we're engaging with an industry partner. So there will almost always be a license to background IP when you engage with an industry partner, and there'll be either a license or an option to a license for project IP that comes out of that sponsored research as well. Licensing happens where there's a clear fit with a technology into an existing business, and it also tends to be used if your product if it's just a one product technology, and also, as I've mentioned before, when we establish a startup company, the intellectual property that the startup company is going to be focused on is generally licensed into the startup company. Now, startup companies, they need a clear product pipeline. They generally have multiple opportunities because you need to be able to demonstrate what that product pipeline is going to look like. So you'll have more mature opportunities and you'll have earlier stage opportunities coming through across time. You're always going to need a fairly substantial patent portfolio and a large potential market. You need to have a very well-defined development path, and you need to have a business plan that you will use to raise capital from investors. And obviously, the big part with startup companies is raising that capital for that first equity investment. So why do companies such as large pharmaceutical companies license research? Well, if we look at what's been happening with the large pharmaceutical companies in recent years, where a lot of drugs have been coming off patent and they've had what they've referred to as the patent cliff, they've ended up with huge gaps in their product pipeline. So one efficient way to fill that product pipeline is to come out to the research institutes, to the universities, and to license technology in, or to engage with R&D contracts to expand that product pipeline. So sometimes they will acquire the new technology, and the advantages for the large pharmaceutical companies of working with the institutes and the universities is that they can acquire expertise that they can't necessarily easily get in-house or replicate in-house. It's also easier for them to cut projects than it is to get rid of a whole team internally. So there's a whole lot of reasons, mainly around risk reduction and diversification, why companies will license research. So what's involved in licensing? How do we go about finding those partners and actually doing the deal? Well, there's a lot of background research that goes into this to find who the suitable partners and companies might be. Once we've established who some of the potential companies might be, it's then about getting to the right contacts. That's done through a variety of different routes. Always you'll leverage your existing contacts first of all. LinkedIn is a massive resource for contacts. You can search for a company. It will show you who in your contacts list is linked in with people in that particular company, so you can use that as an avenue to get to people. And then the big one is that David, Nadia and I, we go to business partnering conferences, so both internationally and nationally, and what's involved with these is prior to the conference you get access to a database where everybody enters what their company is about, what technology they've got, what they're looking for. So we will go in, put a description of our technology and say that we're looking for either an investor or a company that's got an interest in XYZ area, and we'll look for matches. And it's very much a numbers game, and if you're thinking that it sounds a lot like online dating, that's exactly what it is. It's online dating for biotechs. And literally you would have to reach out to 100 or more companies to line up 20 to 25 meetings in the week that you're away. So it's a lot of work. As part of that process, for each opportunity that we're going to be targeting, we'll prepare a 2-page teaser document. And that teaser document will include everything that we've talked about today. It will talk about what problem your technology is solving. It will talk about your competitors, what your competitive advantage is, the potential market, the potential return to investors. And it's just a very brief summary. Sometimes that gets sent when we reach out to people. Sometimes it gets handed over during the meeting. And then from that 20 to 25, you might come away with 3 or 4 good leads where the discussions continue for some period of time. 1 or 2 of those, if you're lucky, might get to a point where they want to look at confidential information, and at that point we'll put a confidentiality agreement in place. The company then does its due diligence on your technology, and at the same time we should be doing our due diligence on them to just get a good feel for whether they are the best partner to be dealing with or not. The next step prior to actually working on an agreement is a term sheet. So a term sheet is a non-binding document usually. It can be binding, but it's more usually non-binding. And it lays out what the deal will look like from a fairly high level. The reason that we use a term sheet really is to make sure that the expectations are being met on each side and that there is a meeting of the minds before you get into the nitty-gritty of negotiating the actual details of the deal. So an actual licensing deal, it will deal with things such as the field of use. So you might have a medical device or a drug that has applications in a number of different therapeutic areas. You might license it for cardiac to one company. They might only be interested in the Japanese market, so you can then license it to another company for, say, Europe and the US. Or you might just license it to one company who's going to cover the globe. But it might have other fields of use as well. So you might then be free to go and talk to another company about using it for lung diseases, for example. So the licenses can be carved up in a number of different ways. A big part of a licensing deal is the upfront and milestone payments. So you generally would get an upfront payment before you start the work or as you start the work. Milestones will be against things such as preclinical studies, getting a lead molecule, an optimized lead molecule, commencement of clinical trials or completion of clinical trials. There's also sometimes milestones around regulatory approvals and around entering specific markets. And finally, royalties. So once a product is on the market, the royalty is the percentage that you get of the sales. So as I've already mentioned, it's important that we do our homework and we do our due diligence on these companies before we get down to actually negotiating an agreement. And that's particularly the case if it's a smaller company. The large pharmaceutical companies, I don't think we have to worry too much about how financially sound they are, but some of the smaller companies you do. You need to understand how much money they've got in the bank, what their cash burn rate is, and also what expertise they've got to take the technology to the market. It's also important to establish early on just how motivated the person is or the company is to do a deal, how serious they are, because as you can see, there's a lot of work involved in this. You don't want to go too far down the path with somebody who's really just talking to you out of interest around the technology rather than seriously wanting to do a deal around it. And you need to understand how committed they would be to the technology as well. And we often address this with performance clauses in licenses. So they will have a certain period of time to achieve certain milestones. And if they don't, then we have the right to take the technology back and start all over again. With all of these deals, we benchmark when we're undergoing the negotiations. We do research into similar types of deals to get a feel for what the milestone payments should be, what the royalties should be, etc. Okay, with a startup company, we form a new entity. The initial shareholders of the new entity are generally the IP owners, so the research institute, or sometimes it might be the founders, it just depends on the arrangement, and investors, the people who put the first lot of capital into that company, and they generally would have a bit over 50% of the company. That's with most of the investors in this space, that would be a requirement. So developing a business plan and a business pitch to go out and find a suitable investor is probably a whole seminar in itself. But just to talk briefly about what the investors are looking for and the things that we need to address, they look very much at the people involved. So that wouldn't just be the scientists, but it would be whoever you have got to be the CEO of that company. They'll be looking at their passion, their commitment, and their ability to execute a commercialisation strategy. They'll be looking at the value proposition, everything that we've spoken about today. They'll want to see a strong intellectual property position to be sure that you have got that barrier to entry to stop anybody else from coming in and competing directly with you. They'll look at the business model, at how you propose you're going to make money and when and how much. And a big thing for investors is that they need to understand upfront how and when they're going to get out of the investment, when they'll get their money back, how they'll get their money back, plus their returns. And this can be, it can be through a trade sale. So a small company might get bought out by a bigger company, and investors get their money and their returns at that point. It might be through an initial public offering, where the company undergoes an IPO, and again, the investors can retrieve a part or all of their money during that process and their returns. Those are the main ways in which the investors will exit the investment. So again, as with the licensing agreement, a term sheet is usually precedes the actual agreement around the investment. A typical term sheet will talk about how much money they're going to put in and the tranches. So by tranches, I mean if they are going to put $10 million into your company, they're not going to give that to you all at once. They're probably going to give you something like 4 or 5 million first of all, and they'll have milestones that they want you to achieve with that first lot of money. And when you've hit those milestones, they'll give you the next part, and so on. There'll be a pre-money valuation. That's all around what the technology is worth before they put their investment into the company. Again, this can be benchmarked through databases and through web searching to get an idea of what the valuation should be. There'll be a share option plan involved in the term sheet, and that's to incentivise employees of the new company and to make sure that they are aligned with the company's goals. There'll always be a license agreement and a research agreement. There'll be a whole section on the rights of shareholders, and there'll be a section dealing with board of directors. So the investors will always have a seat at the board, and often the research institute will as well. All right, so I'm going to hand over to Nadia now to talk about funding options.
So the creation of a startup requires significant capital. This is not an exhaustive list of the types of investors that we have available to us, but these are the major ones that are accessible to us in the biomed space. Typically, these investors will provide funding, as Julia has said, in exchange for owning shares in the potential new company. We have a number of dedicated investment funds that invest at the early stage, i.e. at the start of the company formation, and often they provide additional business support and advice at startup. Additionally, these funders may also provide pre-seed funding to develop a technology of interest, and that is at very early stage. I'll talk about more about the IP group and Uniseed shortly. MRCF actually just stands for Medical Research Commercialization Fund, and they actually support early stage medical research discoveries that originate from their member institutes. So they have member institutes. Other venture funds might include the BTF Fund, which is a biomedical translation fund. The Australian government has established a $500 million fund, which is actually a co-investment venture capital program made up of $250 million from Commonwealth, as well as a match of $250 million from the private sector. The funding is available through 3 private venture capital fund partners that have been licensed to review the investment opportunities. And these are One Ventures, Brandon Capital, and Bioscience Managers. A primary purpose of this funding, though, is to translate biomedical discoveries into high growth potential companies. So they don't necessarily really look at the at the start of the startup phase, like the IP Group, Uniseed, or MRCF. And in addition to that, the eligibility criteria include having a majority of assets and employees within Australia, and basically a turnover of less than 25 million. We also can look to angel investors, which may include high net worth individuals or established angel networks and groups, such as the Sydney Angels and the Melbourne Angels. And actually most cities have their own network of angels, as well as bioangels. Of particular importance here, though, for angel investors is to note that they usually do invest in a particular technology that they either have experience in or a particular interest. So now I'd like to just give you a little bit more about the two funds, Uniseed and IP Group, that we have available to us through the University of Sydney Commercialisation Partners. I think they're worth giving you a little bit more information about here. So a number of universities, along with the University of Sydney, have contributed funds of around, the universities have contributed about 20% and partnered with Uniseed, and they've got a fund worth about 50 million. Uniseed typically invests around 500K into technologies, and then they will want to syndicate if you're exceeding that 700K mark. The universities do have representation on the investment committee. So this means that the universities are not actually at an arm's length of making the decisions of what they invest in. However, there's a real benefit to presenting to Uniseed, as you'll get valuable feedback. And what I've got here is just an example, is Kinoxis is an example of a company startup from the University of Sydney that has received funding from Uniseed. IP Group is actually a publicly listed company that originated out of the UK, and they've partnered now with the Go8 universities in Australia, and have 200 million available for dedicated funds, as well as they also have some funds for proof of concept. Their key interest areas are, healthcare, technology, clean tech, and biotech. They've actually just set up in Australia, so they're currently basically screening opportunities from the Go8. The main difference between IP Group and Uniseed is that IP Group's investment decisions are at an arm's length from the universities. The Go8 partners have not contributed to this fund, and they have actually raised the capital independently for investment. IP Group are also primarily wish to invest 100%, but there's no reason why they can't also work with Uniseed and other funders. There's nothing stopping them from working with other funders if they become interested, like MRCF and Uniseed. IP Group also do provide valuable assessments of your technology, so it is actually worth putting in front of them. And they work with their partners. If they do become interested, they do actually work with the partners, and they do provide support by way of giving advice on the startup and business plans and exit strategies and so on. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about now is industry engagement and block funding. As you are all likely aware, block funding plays a key role in supporting the research system. What I'd like to point out here is that Cat 1 funding is very competitive, and that under the new model for research block grant allocations, we don't get much more overall. And it's actually quite hard to get that piece of the pie. Under the new model for research block grant allocations, industry engagement, or category 2 to 4, results in a significant increase in funding compared to the old model. We'll have a dedicated talk on industry engagement and hopefully more information on the category 2 to 4 grants. But I want to leave you with the message that it's worth paying a lot of attention to industry engagement activities. Not only for block funding, industry engagement plays a key role in multiplying your funding in a number of different areas. Here are just some examples how you might be able to leverage investment generally. So with Category 1 funding alone, you're just going to get that $500K for research and development. If you look at a scenario where you might also have further industry engagement, you would take that $500K, you might be able to also get a little bit of proof of concept funds. We've got some internal proof of concept funds through the university. Other institutes might have internal proof of concept funds. Usually though, these proof of concept funds may not pay, they don't amount to a lot, but they do allow you to develop your technology a little bit further. But the important thing is too that you might look to industry for sponsoring your research here, or for other funding collaborations, and you would be able to increase the amount of funding you get for research and development. And then in doing so and in developing your technology down this track, you might then be in a better position to apply for some of the translation grants with commercial partners, such as ARC linkage and HMRC development, or the CRC program. If you look at a scenario with a startup, this actually shows you how you can multiply your funding. You might have your initial grant success of $500K, but you could take that and match it with a proof of concept fund, such as the Accelerating Commercialization Grant. And then if you went down the route of forming a company, you could then apply a 45% tax incentive, which is the R&D tax credit. And at the end, you would actually get over $1 million in research and development funding. At that point, if you've got a company, you could also look at other grants that would include the translation grants, like with a commercial partner, because you could look at ARC linkage as well with this company. So to summarize, what can you do to structure your research program for commercial success? We've talked about you can start with the end in mind and looking at the tangible product, what process you have or service that you have. You can compare it with competition, ensure you have a good IP position. You want to define the unique selling point of your research, consider the commercial value, recognize that your research may require that further development, so you'll need to plan out your activities. You might want to look for that killer experiment. And also you want to allocate resources to complete a commercially focused research project. So you want to look at what commercial funding sources might exist and leverage your existing research. So lastly, I'd like to tell you that we are planning to have further seminars, mainly guest speakers, and we'd like to try to do this on a monthly basis. And these are in no particular order. They'll be announced when we are able to finalize them. So we'd like to have an industry case study session, and we'll have a guest speaker come in and do that. We also want to invite in one of the seed venture funds and have them talk a little bit more about the opportunities, what they look for in their opportunities, as well as they can give you a little bit more information as to how they operate. And we'll have a guest speaker come in and give that. So that comes to the end of our talk.